This is a recap lesson for high tension situations and dynamic risk assessments. This is from Unit 2, Behavior and Discipline, your exam unit. So first of all, we're going to look at what is a high tension situation. A high tension situation is a situation that is close to the brink of disaster. It's a situation that with one wrong move, the whole thing could descend into chaos. For example, negotiating with terrorists for the release of some hostages. So the causes of high tension situations can be separated into environmental or behavior. For environmental, we're looking at things like war zones, emergency situations, riots, or just every day-to-day high tension situations that the Uniformed Protective Services may come across. The second main cause of high tension situation is behavioral. And this could be emotional reaction, such as aggression, anger, grief, or fear, or medical, an existing medical issue, substance abuse, or due to mental health. To better understand the high tension situation, Glassell came up with his stages of escalation in conflict situations. There are the stages of conflict escalation in 1997. Conflict is normal and it only becomes a problem when it spirals out of control. For the most part, we go about our day-to-day lives having many bouts of conflict which we deal with there and then. They never escalate into a situation where it becomes a problem. However, Glassell's model can help you figure out at what stage of a conflict each party is on. And this model can work on all kinds of conflicts such as arguments at work, divorce, or even international wars. So it's broke up into three main stages, and within each of those stages there's different levels. You have win-win facilitation, win-lose mediation, or lose-lose forcible interventions. In a win-win situation where we look at facilitation, the first stage of any conflict is going to be tension. The conflict isn't even voiced at this stage, and it isn't even often recognized as a conflict at this point. We can just feel that there's going to be tension there. Again, if we manage to stop the conflict at any of these stages, we're able to effectively deal with that conflict. The second step is debate. Parties start to talk. They try to convince each other that they are right. It's black and white thinking. It's I'm right, you're wrong. Stage 3 is actions start to replace words. There's no more discussions. Actions are underline each party's stance. Empathy with the other person starts to shrink. We start to lose the ability to understand where the other person is coming from. At this level, discussions are normally quite factual. We're telling the truth. We're seeing things as they are. And when asked, parties can still name some positive qualities of the other person or the other party. If we manage to stop the conflict at this level, all parties can win. They can save face, we can save face, everyone walks away happy. We can have a positive outcome from the conflict if it is stopped at this stage. However, if it's not stopped at this stage, we move into win-lose or mediation. And this is where we start to look for coalitions. Parties look for supporters to back up what they're saying. They start to argue with people or start to try and get other people to join their side of the argument. The original issue becomes a little bit less important now because it's all about winning. If we still don't deal with the conflict at this stage, we move into the loss of face. We try and make the opposition look bad, include exaggerations, lies, and generally saying things that we think will harm them or make them look bad. The sixth stage of Glassell's stages of conflict escalation is threats. Parties try and gain control by threatening the opposition. For example, I want to speak to your manager. I'll have you fired for this. If you're a police officer, I will have your badge. At this level of the conflict, it's all about the relationship or the breakdown of that relationship. If we can maintain that relationship, we have an opportunity to try and de-escalate the situation and end up with a positive outcome for at least one of us. But if we don't manage to deal with the conflict at this stage, we move into lose-lose. And this is forcible interventions. And the first step of this is, well, step 7 of the overall stages of conflict escalation is limited destruction. The opponent is not seen as human anymore. We just want to damage them. Our own losses are okay as long as they lose more. I'm happy to take a little bit of damage here as long as I hurt them more. And again, if we don't manage to deal well with the conflict at this stage, it escalates into annihilation. The opponents and their supporters must be annihilated at all means. So initially, let's say you have somebody dealing with the police. In limited destruction, they may want to harm just that police officer. And again, when I say harm, it could be physical, mental, emotional. It doesn't always have to be physical. But they just want to harm that individual police officer. Now, in the annihilation stage, it's that police officer and every other police officer who's there with them. I want to harm them in some way, shape, or form. And again, that could be in many different ways. And then finally, into the abyss. This is personal annihilation is completely acceptable as long as the opponents go down as well. So the picture that I showed in class is somebody who's they're being arrested and they're fighting back. They're in the abyss. I'm getting arrested anyway. I might as well try and take this police officer down with me while I go. Now, at all of these 3 stages, limited destruction, annihilation, and the abyss, they are a lose-lose. We do not want to get into this situation. There is no positive outcome for anybody at this stage. They are willing to go down and be arrested, get hurt, as long as they hurt us as well. So at all costs, we need to try and stop a conflict before it gets to this stage. Either ideally in the win-win, or if we need to, a win-lose where we win and they lose. But we need to prevent it getting into the lose-lose, because this is where dangerous situations really occur and they can harm us just as much as they harm themselves. Another way to try and understand how high tension situation happens is called the attitude behavior cycle. So the attitude behavior cycle looks like a circle, and it basically starts at the top and says that my attitude affects my behavior, and my behavior will affect your attitude, and your attitude will affect your behavior, and then it comes back then around to me. So how you're behaving starts to affect my attitude, and it's a cycle that keeps on going around. So the victory box theory linked attitude and behavior in the circular diagram. It helps identify how attitudes and behaviors can impact each other. A positive attitude can encourage positive behavior, which will influence others to behave and think in the same way. This will in turn be reflected back at the person who will exhibit the same level of positive attitude and positive behavior. Now this is the positive side of the attitude behavior cycle. However, negative attitudes will also lead to negative behaviors, which in turn will influence other people to have those same negative influences or negative attitudes and behaviors back towards us. So let's think of this in terms of the Uniformed Protective Services. If you have a police officer who's out on patrol, and if they have a negative attitude towards that specific area that they are trying to patrol, their behaviors, how they act to the people living in the area, will also be negative. Because you have a police officer who is behaving in a negative manner towards the people living in the area, the people in the area will have a negative attitude towards that police officer and eventually towards the police. Because of that negative attitude, their behavior will become negative too towards that police officer. And that just reinforces what that police officer thought at the very beginning, and the cycle continues. Now, we need to be able to break that cycle, and there are a number of ways in which that cycle can be broken. So first is by taking time, pausing before responding to an attitude or behavior in a negative manner. Can you be the one to change that cycle, even if their attitude or their behavior is negative towards us? Because we understand this attitude behavior cycle, can we be the one to flip the narrative and try and have a positive attitude, or at least a positive behavior towards that person? Choosing to respond to a negative behavior in a positive manner. We may also explore the reasons for there being negativity, and positive reinforcement through rehabilitation or counseling. So because we are the people in a position of authority as members of the Uniformed Protective Services, it's our responsibility to try and break that cycle. We can't expect the general public to do that for us. We have to take ownership of this and change the cycle ourselves. So I said earlier on that we really want to avoid a situation escalating into a lose-lose situation. So we're going to look at some strategies that we can use to diffuse a high tension situation. The first is having situational awareness. Now, situational awareness is the ability to perceive and process potential threats in the environment. It makes us essentially aware of how our actions may influence the situation. We need to read the room essentially. You may need to get close to engage the person to calm them down by going hands-on, possibly arresting them. That may de-escalate the situation. But actually, in some instances, trying to do that may escalate the situation even further. So in those instances, we need to back off and give that person a bit of space. But understanding how your actions may influence that situation is vital for de-escalation. Next is body language. How we stand, how we portray ourselves has a massive impact on how the public will see us. The influence of body language on the outcome of potential conflict situations, we're going to try and use verbal and non-verbal communication to signal non-aggression. If we are trying to demonstrate that we are being the aggressive one, we will end up escalating that situation. At all times, we need to maintain that self-control and be assertive in the situation. Not aggressive, but assertive. And finally, empathy and active listening to facilitate understanding. We said earlier on about trying to understand where negativity is coming from. If we listen to them, talk to them, listen to them, we are more likely to understand where they're coming from and be able to deal with that situation more effectively. Next is emotional awareness. And this is, and self-regulation. So emotional awareness and self-regulation are key aspects of emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence is the ability to identify and manage your own emotions, but also the emotions of other people around you, the members of the public that you're dealing with. When the police had done a survey on their officers, the officers felt that the emotional intelligence was closely linked to their ability to communicate effectively in difficult situations. They talked about the importance of showing empathy, about understanding the reasons for a person's behavior, for being aware of their own behaviors on others, and also being aware of the impact factors can have on decision making. So how well police officers were able to understand other people's emotions and regulate their own emotions was very closely linked to how well they felt they dealt with difficult situations. And a key area for having that emotional intelligence is going to be active listening. So active listening is a system of opening and maintaining communications through the use of empathy, listening, and body language. We're starting to put some of those other skills that we talked about just recently all together to demonstrate active listening. It's a skill that can be acquired and developed with practice. It's very hard for us just to be naturally good at active listening. We will take practice and it will take time. Active listening can be quite difficult to master, so the development of it may take time and patience. Active listening should be used throughout all encounters to try and understand where the person is coming from, so either the victim or the suspect, to try and understand where they're coming from, what information they can provide us, and making sure that they feel heard. So the FBI developed a mnemonic to try and help their hostage negotiators remember some of the key steps of active listening when under pressure, and they call it Morphe's. This model can be used in a wide range of situations, but some of the things that we're looking for is minimal encouragers. Use verbal and non-verbal communication to show that you're listening and interested in what the other person is saying. We need to try and use open questions at all times rather than closed questions, try and draw out that additional information from the person. And quite often, if we just let them speak, they will give us plenty of information. R stands for reflection, and that's where we repeat or echo recent words that the person has used. This is to demonstrate that we have been listening what they're saying, because we are repeating some of the parts of what they've said back to them, so we demonstrate we've been listening. And then the use of effective pauses. Use silence before or after something really, really important. This can demonstrate how important it is and also allows the person to vent their frustration. It gives you time to think, but also it will give them time to think as well. Encourage turn taking in a conversation, so we speak, they speak, we speak, they speak, and try to help everyone to focus their thoughts and intention. The P will stand for paraphrase, and this is where we summarize what the person has been saying in your own words to demonstrate that you, first of all, have heard it, but that you understand it, because you're putting it back in your own words, that you really understand what it means. And it just will allow the other person an opportunity to clarify if you've got anything wrong. Where possible, you want to use I messages. Start sentences with I to personalize what you're saying and show responsibility and trying to establish rapport with that person. We want to try and use emotional labeling. Tell the person that you understand what effect that this situation, this difficult situation that they're in, may be having on them. So for example, I can see that you're upset. This must be very frustrating for you. And finally, the summary. Sum up what has been said in your own words. So if we follow all these steps, we can demonstrate that we are active listening, that we're understanding what the person has said. We've given them opportunities to correct what our understanding is of it, and we can help build that relationship and rapport with the people that we're communicating with. And that communication is vital for all of the uniform protective services. Having those communication skills is really important because you can introduce yourself, ask the other person for their name, and use it. When we use someone's name, it becomes much more personal. We can build up that rapport. When we're communicating with somebody, we want to minimize the number of people dealing with the situation, but keep others in standby just in case you need them. Where possible, we want to have one-to-one conversations with these people, because when you have a crowd from either our side or their side, it can put the other person on the defensive, or it can escalate the situation further. Try to speak clearly, use simple language, avoid using jargon and slang where appropriate. The Uniform Protective Services in general are very good at coming up with jargon for their terminology and their processes. Make sure that any jargon or try to avoid any jargon and use the proper terms where possible. And then finally, you want to check that understand that you have explained it in terms that that person can understand, because again, they are not police officers, they're not paramedics, they're not firefighters. They have to understand what is going to happen next. We want to always try and use open questions, try and engage that person. Like when we talked about in Morphe's, we want to try and allow them to give us more of the information. If we use closed questions, we're limiting what they can tell us. We want to try and explain the actions that you're about to take. So even when you are going to arrest somebody and you're going hands-on, you want to make sure you're still explaining the process that's happening. You keep telling them exactly what's happening. I'm arresting you for this. I'm going to do this. The next step is this. You're continually explaining the actions that you're taking to them. And then where possible, you want to avoid commands beginning with don't, and try and use some outcome-focused language. Like, this is what's going to happen next. You need to do this. We're going to do this. The next step is this. When we're explaining the actions that we're taking, we also need to keep talking even when we're going hands-on. It's very easy that when we start to go hands-on and start to process the arrest, that we stop explaining what's happening. But even through that, we need to keep explaining what's happening. Where possible, we want to avoid shouting, using raised voices, or threatening language. We need to remain calm. Like when we look back at the agile behavior cycle, when we are not remaining calm, the other person is definitely not going to remain calm. Use the pronoun I rather than you to take responsibility and promote cooperation and understanding. And be assertive rather than aggressive. For example, I want to help you, your aim, but you're making it very difficult for me, the consequence, when you shout and swear, the situation that you've been faced in. So you're being assertive there rather than being aggressive and shouting and screaming back at them. And finally, you want to use deflection and redirection to deal with swearing, vulgarity, and insults. So for example, I appreciate what you're saying, or I hear what you're saying, but this has to happen. I understand you are frustrated. So we're trying to deflect, we're trying to redirect any swearing, vulgarity, and insults. while we have these communication skills, we have to be very conscious of overcoming any barriers to communication. So type of barriers that we may have to communication, first of all, could be physical barriers. There could be physically something in the way. There could be a door in the way. There could be, if it's a part of a public order, like a riot, then we might have visors in the way. Those can be barriers to communication. The next is social or attitudinal. If they're not ready to listen to members of the Uniformed Protective Services, or society has, or from a social aspect, they have always been told to not, let's say, talk to the police, then that's going to be a barrier to effective communications. Next is another barrier, could be psychological or emotional. Are they in the right frame of mind to be able to speak to us? If they've just witnessed a horrific crime, or if they've just committed a crime, they may not be in an emotional place to be able to effectively communicate with us. And finally, linguistic. So this is, have we the ability to communicate with them in a language that they can understand? Now one of the great things about the UK is we are a multicultural society. So as a police officer, you may come across people who do not speak English as their first language. So to be able to effectively communicate with them, we may need to get an interpreter. It could be that we need to get someone who knows sign language to come and help us communicate. There is different barriers that could be put in place there that will prevent us from effectively communicating with that person. And we need to make sure that we take all of these barriers into account when we're trying to communicate with somebody. So when we are in these high tension situations, it's really important that we continue to assess the risk. And this is referred to as a dynamic risk assessment. A dynamic risk assessment is a process of assessing the risk in a developing and changing situation. You might not always be able to know exactly the level of risk which you're walking into ahead of time. So you have to fully assess them as you get there. Dynamic risk assessments are often used to continually assess to allow for unknown risks when handling uncertainty. So according to the Home Office Dynamic Management of Risk at Operational Incidents, a dynamic risk assessment is the continuous process of identifying hazards, assessing risks, taking action to eliminate or reduce risk, monitoring and reviewing in a rapidly changing circumstances of an operational incident. In lesson, we went through a video of a police officer explaining the things that they're looking at as they're doing a response driving. As they're responding to an incident, they're on blue lights, they're traveling through a built-up area at as fast as they can safely, and he's explaining what is he seeing and what is he taking into account as he drives. To see this video, go to PowerPoint 12.1 to see an example of the dynamic risk assessment. So, factors of a dynamic risk assessment. The first thing we have to look at is the situation. Then we look at the hazards, the environment, the reactionary gap or proximate zones, early signs of potential aggression, and from these, we're able to try and decide how risky is that situation that we're in at that moment. So the first one is situation. So we need to be aware of how our actions may influence the situation that we're trying to deal with. You may need to get close and engage with that person to try and calm them down, but you may also need to back off and give that person some more space. Understanding how our behavior and our actions may influence this situation is something that we have to assess on an ongoing basis. The next thing we have to look at is the hazards. So we have to identify where the current hazards are, but also identify what may become a hazard in the future. And this may even be our own equipment if it falls into the wrong hands. So in lesson, we looked at a picture of two members of the ambulance service trying to wrestle a needle out of a patient's hand. They were trying to treat that patient, and the person grabbed the needle and tried to attack the members of the ambulance service. So in this situation, their own equipment had become a hazard in the wrong hands. The next step in a dynamic risk assessment is looking at the environment that you're in. So we have to consider the environment that we're in and how hostile it may become towards us if we take the wrong steps. How welcoming is your presence in that situation? Or even if you're trying to help, the general public may not, or the people at that scene may not want your help. The clip or the picture that I showed in a lesson was 3 or 4 young males surrounding a paramedic, and the picture was taken from their body camera. So in that instance, even though they're a paramedic, they're trying to help that person or trying to help somebody at that scene, their presence was not welcome, and that was something that they had to consider when doing their dynamic risk assessment. Within the environment, you have to think, do you have an exit strategy to get out of that environment should that situation turn violent? Are you in a position that should things go wrong, are you able to safely get yourself out of that? Now that could be if you're in a room trying to maintain your back to the door, because then you're trying to stay between the other person and the door, so you always have an exit route behind you. It could be in or on the street. Do you have backup available? Do you have a means of getting out of that situation should it turn bad? So in lesson, we looked at a video of some police officers dealing with some party goers on a Saturday night. 2 people had too much to drink and they had started a fight. So one person was down injured because of that fight, and the police were the first on the scene. So while the police officer needs to try and help the person who's on the ground injured, they can't properly deal with them because the environment around them is not safe for them to focus on the person who's hurt yet. They have to deal with the environment first because they've assessed the risk, and if they don't deal with that environment first, the situation may escalate even further. In lesson, we should have a look at that video. If you want to have a look at that video, go to PowerPoint 12.1 to see an example of how an environment could affect our dynamic risk assessment. Next thing that we have to consider is the reactionary gap, or the proximal zones. This is the space between you and any other threat that may be in the environment. Where possible, we want to try and maintain a reactionary gap of about 1.25 to 2 meters of a gap. This will give us enough time to try and react to any dangers that may arise. This means that we're able to deal with the conflict effectively. So people in the Uniform Protective Service are taught a process called boogie. And the mnemonic boogie is to try and create time and space for protective service work to assess the risk and decide on the most appropriate course of action to try and deal with that situation, or where possible, defuse that situation. So first B is be prepared to back off. If our presence and us getting close to the person is escalating the situation, we may have to back off to try and de-escalate it. U is use effective cover. Can we get some physical barrier between us and the person who may potentially become aggressive or escalate into a dangerous situation? G is give space and time if possible. Let the person that you're dealing with have time to think about their actions and try and de-escalate themselves. And E stands for early negotiation. Try and talk to them, try and calm them down, try and understand where they're coming from so we can try and help them de-escalate the situation as well. And the last E is evacuate the immediate area if we need to. The final step of a dynamic risk assessment is trying to spot the early signs of potential aggression. So prevention and early intervention are the most effective strategies to try and stop a situation escalating out of control and into a crisis situation when a physical attack is most likely to happen. Aggression is most often associated with anger, but if we arrive at a scene and somebody is afraid, or they're feeling guilty, or they've just lost somebody and they are arguing with us as to why it took us so long to get that scene, this could also trigger aggression. But there are some telltale signs and behaviors that someone is about to become aggressive. It's vital that we try and de-escalate the situation as soon as we spot these signs. So in class we looked at a picture of a group of people who had just been victims of a terrorist attack in a hypothetical situation. And I wanted students to understand or try and decide who was most likely, or who looked like they're most likely about to become aggressive. And it was from numbers 1 to 9. The person that was most likely to become aggressive was number 6. Again, this can be found on the PowerPoint on Teams. So the reason that we the reason that this person is the most likely to become aggressive will work from the top down, is facial expressions. There's a tense or lowering of eyebrows. Someone might express feelings of anger by lowering their eyebrows. Their head could also be tilted downwards. This type of stare is characterized as a long, hard stare with little to no blinking, almost like a death stare. We will also see some pupil dilation. Someone who's feeling threatened or considering getting violent with you, their pupils will expand to take in as much of their surrounding as possible. This is part of our fight, flight, or freeze processes. Nostrils will start to flare to try and let more oxygen in, because again, going back to their fight or flight, if they're about to fight, the body's going to need oxygen to try and deal with that situation. We'll also start to see teeth showing or pursed lips. So pursed lips is when we press the lips together really tightly and almost to the point where we can't see them anymore. And finally, for the facial expressions, we're looking for a clenched jaw. Now, a clenched jaw is something that we might be able to spot from up just in front of the ears. The muscles just in front of the ears will sort of bulge out a little bit when the jaw really clenches closed. Some of the body language that we're looking for somebody who may potentially become aggressive is clenched fist. While open fists may indicate openness and acceptance, closed fists can show anger or dismissal. They will often try and have them in front of the body, because that's where they're trying, because of the fight or flight, they'll have their hands in front of the body to protect any vital organs. So we want to watch for clenched fists at the side of the body or just in front of the hips, because again, the harder the person is clenching their fists, the more muscles around the forearms you can usually see. You may also start to see whitening of the knuckles because the blood is not traveling there as readily. Overall, we'll also start to see a tightening of the muscles. The body is prepared for a physical altercation. The brain wants to protect those vital organs. So the whole muscle will become, the whole body will become tense and rigid. Moving down to the feet, the person who's potentially about to become aggressive will also often subconsciously do something called blading. Blading is where they will bring their dominant foot back and point the toe out to about 45 degrees. This gives you a good launch platform to try and attack somebody. It's similar to what a boxer would use in a ring. This position allows for more powerful punches and will slightly turn the body to the side to reduce risks to vital organs. Some other behaviors of potential aggression, so we can spot them, could be that they start huffing and puffing. If they feel trapped and in a small space, they may start pacing up and down with rapid movements. They will start to raise their voice, they will shout and scream. They will start to demonstrate aggressive actions, like pointing towards, like really pointing at it, hitting things, throwing things around. And they will often start to use threatening words as well, including swearing. And they will often start to become argumentative or belligerent. They won't follow any advice, and they can't be talked down. Again, at this stage, it's a good indication that they're about to become aggressive, and we need to either back away or put some physical barriers between us and them, or start to get into a position where we have an exit route from this situation. The following acronym, STAMP, can be used to best describe the behaviors exhibited by a person who is about to become aggressive. They'll begin agitated and may become violent. So the first thing that we're looking for is staring, prolonged staring at staff. This is often referred to as target fixation. I mentioned it earlier on, like a death stare, a long hard stare with very little blinking. Next could be the tone of the voice. Their voice may become sharp, sarcastic, loud, or argumentative. A is for anxiety, a flushed face, heavy breathing, rapid speech, reaction or a lowered reaction to pain. M is for muttering. It could be talking under their breath, criticizing staff to themselves, or mimicking staff. P is for pacing. They walk around in a confined space, walking into areas that are off limit to try and push where they can go. So these 5 things could be a good indicator of potential aggression and somebody who is starting to become agitated and may become violent. So that is it for high tension situation and dynamic risk assessments. The PowerPoints that were used in this video are weeks 11.1, 11.2, and 12.1, which can be found on Teams.